Welcome back to the Bible Stories. As you watch today, you will notice there are no ads playing on this video. That is because YouTube has completely demonetized our channel. We now depend on support from viewers like you to keep making these videos. If the videos on our channel have blessed your life, please consider supporting us by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description. Buried deep inside the book of Isaiah, there is a riddle that nobody in the ancient world could solve. A servant of God is described in stunning detail. He was cut off out of the land of the living. He is dead. His grave is assigned. His body is laid in the ground. And then, just 2 verses later, the same text says he shall see his seed and prolong his days. A dead man who sees children. A dead man who looks back at his own suffering and is satisfied with what it produced. How do you solve that? How does someone who has been cut off from life go on to see the results of what his death accomplished? For centuries, readers stared at those words and had no answer. And then, one weekend in Jerusalem, the answer walked out of a tomb. This is Isaiah chapter 53. It is the most detailed prophecy about the death and resurrection of the Messiah in the Old Testament, and it was written hundreds of years before Jesus was born. But to truly understand what this passage says and why it matters so deeply, you need to see something that almost everyone misses. The suffering servant passage does not start at Isaiah chapter 53 verse 1. It starts 3 verses earlier at Isaiah chapter 52 verse 13. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, so his appearance was marred beyond human likeness, and his form beyond that of the children of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for what had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall understand. Look at what God says about this servant in just 3 verses. First, he will be exalted and lifted up and made very high. That is the language of ultimate honor. In the book of Isaiah, being lifted up and exalted is used to describe God himself. This servant will reach the highest place imaginable. But then his appearance was marred beyond human likeness. His body was so damaged, so broken, so disfigured that he barely looked human anymore. Many were astonished at the sight of him, not astonished in admiration, astonished in horror. And then this same disfigured servant will affect many nations. Kings, the most powerful people on earth, will shut their mouths because of him, not because he threatened them, not because he conquered their armies, but because they will see something they were never told about and understand something they had never heard before. Exaltation, disfigurement, global impact, all in 3 verses, all about one unnamed servant. This is the doorway into Isaiah chapter 53, and you cannot understand what happens inside unless you walk through this door first. But there is something even deeper going on. This servant does not appear out of nowhere in Isaiah chapter 52. He has been appearing throughout the book of Isaiah in a series of 4 passages that scholars call the servant songs. The first song is in Isaiah chapter 42. God introduces his servant. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nations. The servant is gentle. He does not cry out in the streets. He will be a covenant for the people and a light to the Gentiles. At this point, the servant could be the nation of Israel. God calls Israel his servant earlier in the book. The second song is in Isaiah chapter 49, and here something changes. In verse 3, the servant is called Israel. But then in verses 5 and 6, God says the servant's mission is to restore Israel and to be a light to the nations. Read that again carefully. The servant is called Israel, but his job is to bring Israel back to God. That does not make sense. The servant is being distinguished from the nation, even while being connected to it. The third song is in Isaiah chapter 50. Now the servant speaks in his own voice. He describes being struck and spat upon. He gives his back to those who beat him, and his cheeks to those who tear out his beard. He does not hide his face from shame, and yet he trusts God completely. The servant is choosing to suffer. This is not random punishment. It is deliberate surrender. And then the fourth and final song begins in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13, and runs through the end of chapter 53. Everything the first three songs have been building toward arrives here. The servant's identity narrows from a nation down to a single person. His suffering is revealed to be substitutionary, and his death is followed by something the text can only describe as life beyond death. Now we arrive at the heart of Isaiah chapter 53, and it begins with a question. Who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Someone is speaking, a group. They say, our and we, and what follows is a confession. These speakers are admitting that they completely misjudged the servant. They looked at him and saw nothing worth admiring. They watched him suffer and assumed God was punishing him for something he did wrong. And now they realize they were wrong about everything. For he grew up before him like a tender plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. The servant did not arrive the way anyone expected. He did not come from a palace. He grew up like a small plant, struggling to survive in dry soil. There was nothing physically impressive about him, no outward sign of power, no royal appearance. He was despised, rejected, familiar with pain. People turned their faces away from him because they did not want to look at him. This already does not match what most people expected the Messiah to be. Israel was waiting for a king who would overthrow their enemies, a warrior, a political deliverer. What they got instead was a man of sorrows. And that mismatch between expectation and reality is exactly why the speakers confess that they misjudged him. But then comes the real shock. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. The speakers are saying, we thought God was punishing him. We thought his suffering was about him, but it was about us. He was carrying our grief. He was wounded because of what we did wrong. The punishment that should have fallen on us fell on him instead. And through his wounds we were healed. This is substitution. The servant takes the place of the guilty. He bears what they deserve, so they can receive what he deserves. And then comes one of the most carefully structured verses in all of Scripture. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Look at the shape of this verse. It opens with all we, and it closes with us all. It begins with the universal problem. Everyone has wandered. Everyone has gone their own way. No one is exempt. And it ends with the universal solution. The Lord has taken all of that wandering and placed it on one person. The first all is the diagnosis. The last all is the remedy. The sin of everyone was placed on someone, and between the diagnosis and the remedy stands the servant, carrying the full weight of what the entire human race has done. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. The servant does not fight back. He does not defend himself. He does not cry out for justice, even though he is innocent. He goes to his death the way a lamb goes to the altar, silently, willingly, without resistance. He was taken away by oppression and judgment, and who considered his fate? For he was cut off out of the land of the living, struck down for the transgression of my people. Now, pay close attention to that phrase. For the transgression of my people, he was struck down. Whether these are the words of God or the words of Isaiah, my people refers to Israel. So the servant is struck down for the transgressions of Israel. If the servant is Israel, then Israel is dying for the sins of Israel. That does not work as substitution. Someone else is dying in their place. The servant and the people he dies for are not the same. Then comes a prophecy so specific it reads like a signature. They made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. His grave was assigned with criminals. That was the plan, but he actually ended up buried with a rich man. These two details seem to contradict each other. How can someone be buried with the wicked and also with the rich? Now turn to Matthew chapter 27. Jesus was crucified between two criminals. He was scheduled for a criminal's burial. But Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man and a follower of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked for the body. He wrapped it in clean linen and placed it in his own new tomb, cut from rock, a tomb that had never been used, buried with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. Both details separated by the word "but," fulfilled in a single weekend. This was not something anyone could have engineered. A dead man does not choose where he is buried. But the God who wrote the prophecy also orchestrated the fulfillment. Now we reach Isaiah chapter 53, verse 10. Yet it pleased the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days, and the will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. There is so much in this single verse that most teaching barely scratches the surface. First, notice who is behind the servant's death, not just the people who killed him. The Lord, God himself. It pleased the Lord to crush him. This does not mean God enjoyed the suffering. It means God's will, God's purpose, and God's plan were being accomplished through the servant's death. The cross was not an accident. It was not plan B. It was what God intended from the beginning. But now, look at the word Isaiah uses for the servant's death. In Hebrew, the word translated offering for guilt or offering for sin is asham. It is a specific term from the book of Leviticus. The asham is the guilt offering, also called the trespass offering, described in Leviticus chapter 5 and chapter 6. And the guilt offering was different from every other sacrifice in Israel's system. Here is what made it unique. The guilt offering required restitution. If someone had wronged God or wronged their neighbor, they did not just bring an animal to the altar and receive forgiveness. They had to restore what was stolen or damaged, and then add a fifth of the value on top of it, 20% more than what was taken. The asham was not just about paying a penalty. It was about making things more than right. It was about restoring what was lost and adding to it. When Isaiah says the servant's soul becomes an asham, a guilt offering, he is saying something extraordinary. The servant does not just cancel a debt. He does not just absorb punishment. He restores what sin has broken, and he adds to it. Through his death, the outcome is not merely that people return to where they were before sin entered the picture. They receive more than what was lost. Grace does not simply undo the damage. Grace exceeds it. This is why Paul would later write, "Where sin increased, grace increased all the more." The seed of that idea is already planted right here in Isaiah chapter 53 in the single Hebrew word, asham. And now we arrive at the riddle we began with. The servant has been killed. He was cut off from the land of the living. He was buried. And yet verse 10 says, he shall see his offspring and prolong his days. Verse 11 says, he shall see the result of the suffering of his soul and be satisfied. But how? There is only one answer. The servant comes back to life. Isaiah does not use the word resurrection, but the logic of the text demands it. You cannot say someone was cut off from life and then say he will see results and live long days unless something happens between those two statements. Something that reverses death, something that brings him out of the grave. The text creates a problem that it does not explicitly solve. It builds a paradox and then leaves it hanging in the air. And for centuries, that paradox had no resolution. Until a man from Nazareth was crucified on a Friday and walked out of a tomb on a Sunday. And suddenly, the riddle had its answer. But there is one more detail about this part of the passage that most people do not know. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd near the Dead Sea stumbled into a cave and found ancient scrolls hidden in clay jars. Among them was the great Isaiah scroll, the oldest complete copy of any book of the Bible ever discovered. It was dated to roughly 125 years before Jesus was born. When scholars compared this ancient scroll to the Hebrew Bible used in synagogues and churches today, they found that the two texts were remarkably similar. After more than 1,000 years of being copied by hand, the text had been preserved with extraordinary accuracy. But in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 11, there was one small difference. The traditional Hebrew text reads, he shall see the result of the suffering of his soul and be satisfied. The verb see has no stated object. He shall see what? The Dead Sea Scroll answers that question. It includes one additional Hebrew word, or light. He shall see light and be satisfied. 3 separate Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts contain this word. The ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, also contains it. It was present in the oldest copies, and at some point during the centuries of hand copying, the word was lost from the text that became the standard. Why does this matter? Because in Hebrew, to see light is an idiom. It means to be alive. In the book of Job, those who die before birth are described as never seeing light. In the Psalms it says, for with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. So what the oldest known copy of Isaiah actually says is this. After the servant's soul is made an offering for guilt, after he is cut off from the land of the living, after he is buried, he shall see light. He shall be alive again. The resurrection was written into the text. And it took a shepherd boy stumbling into a cave 2,000 years later for that word to come back to the surface. Long before Christianity existed, ancient Jewish interpreters read this passage and recognized that it was about the Messiah. In the Babylonian Talmud, in a section called Sanhedrin 98b, the rabbis discuss the name of the Messiah. One answer given is the leper scholar, or the sick one, and the reason they give is a direct quotation from Isaiah chapter 53, verse 4. Surely he has borne our sicknesses and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. The Talmud is not a Christian document. It is the foundational text of rabbinic Judaism. And in that text, the rabbis link Isaiah chapter 53 to the Messiah. Even more revealing is what happened in the Targum, the ancient Aramaic translation of the prophets that was read aloud in synagogues. The Targum opens this passage with a stunning addition, where the Hebrew text says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely." The Targum adds 2 words, "Behold, my servant, the Messiah, shall prosper. The Targum identifies the servant as the Messiah. There is no ambiguity. But then something remarkable happens. The Targum rewrites the rest of the passage. Every line about suffering is changed so that the Messiah is no longer the one who suffers. Instead, the Messiah is the one who causes suffering to the enemies of Israel. The exaltation stays. The suffering is removed and reassigned. This tells us something important. The ancient interpreters could see that this passage was about the Messiah. That was clear to them. What they could not accept was that the Messiah would suffer. A suffering Messiah did not fit their expectations, so they kept the identification and changed the description. It was not until the 11th century that a rabbi named Rashi, the most influential Jewish commentator in history, introduced the interpretation that the servant represents the nation of Israel suffering among the nations. Rashi lived during the First Crusade, when Jewish communities were being massacred by armies marching toward Jerusalem. His interpretation may have been shaped by the terrible suffering his people were enduring. Before Rashi, the messianic reading was the dominant view. After Rashi, the national reading became standard in Judaism. But even centuries after Rashi, Jewish scholars continued to acknowledge the older tradition. Rabbi Moshe Alshich, writing in the 16th century, stated plainly, "Our rabbis with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the King Messiah." The history of interpretation is more complex than either side usually admits. But the evidence is clear. The earliest and most widespread reading of this passage in Jewish tradition was messianic. But there is something even more important than how the ancient interpreters read this passage. It is how Jesus himself read it. On the night before he was crucified, Jesus gathered with his disciples for a final meal. He knew what was coming. He knew he would be arrested, tried, beaten, and killed. And in that moment, he reached back to Isaiah chapter 53 and claimed it as his own. The Gospel of Luke records his words, "For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me, and he was numbered with the transgressors, for what is written about me has its fulfillment." Jesus quoted Isaiah chapter 53 verse 12 and said it must be fulfilled in him. He did not leave it to his followers to connect the dots after his death. He told them in advance. He walked into his suffering knowing exactly which ancient text he was stepping into. And this was not the only time. In Mark chapter 10 verse 45, Jesus said, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The phrase "for many" echoes Isaiah chapter 53, verse 12. He bore the sin of many. Jesus understood his mission through the lens of this passage. After his resurrection, the connection became even clearer. In the book of Acts, chapter 8, an Ethiopian official is traveling home from Jerusalem, sitting in his chariot, reading from a scroll of Isaiah. The passage he is reading is Isaiah chapter 53. He comes to the verse about the lamb led to slaughter and asks a follower of Jesus named Philip, "Who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else?" And beginning from that very passage, Philip told him the good news about Jesus. This is the only recorded account in the New Testament of someone being brought to faith through a specific reading of Isaiah chapter 53. And it happened because the passage was so vivid, so detailed, and so clearly describing someone that a man reading it for the first time could not rest until he knew who it was about. Now, look at what the passage says this servant actually achieved. "By his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities." The servant justifies many. He does not just suffer. He does not just die. He makes people righteous. And the way he does it is by bearing their iniquities. Their guilt is placed on him. and in exchange his righteousness is given to them. This is not a vague promise. This is the foundation of what the New Testament calls justification by faith. And it appears here centuries before Paul ever wrote a letter in the words of an Old Testament prophet. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors. The servant poured out his soul to death. He was counted as a criminal. He bore the sin of many. And even while dying, he made intercession for the very people who were killing him. Now turn to Luke chapter 23, verse 34. As Jesus hung on the cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He was making intercession for the transgressors, exactly as Isaiah had written. Here is the final thing you need to see about this passage. The passage does not begin with suffering, and it does not end with suffering. It begins with glory. "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high." And it ends with glory. "Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong." The suffering is real. It is terrible. It fills the center of the passage with some of the most intense language in all of Scripture. Borne, carried, wounded, crushed, stricken, oppressed, afflicted, cut off, poured out. Every word adds weight to the cost, but the suffering is enclosed by glory on both sides. It starts with exaltation, it ends with victory. The cross is not the end of the story, it is the middle. This is the structure of the gospel itself. Before his death, Jesus existed in glory. After his resurrection, he was exalted to the highest place. And between those two glories, he walked through the valley of suffering and death, carrying the weight of what the entire human race had done. Isaiah saw it. He wrote it down. He captured the shape of the story hundreds of years before it happened. And that is why this passage is the most important prophecy every Christian needs to hear. Because it does not just predict that the Messiah would suffer. It explains why. It reveals what his death accomplished. It shows what was happening behind the rejection that no one at the time could see. The people who watched the servant suffer thought God was punishing him for his own sins. They were wrong. He was carrying theirs. The people who saw him die thought it was a defeat. In reality, it was the plan of God, an offering that would restore more than what sin had ever stolen. The people who buried him thought the story was over. But this was only the beginning. He would see light again. He would see his offspring. He would prolong his days. He would look at the result of his suffering and be satisfied. Because the servant who was crushed did not stay crushed, the lamb who was led to the slaughter was also the one who would divide the spoil with the strong. And the man of sorrows who was despised and rejected by men was the same one of whom God said, "He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high." This is Isaiah chapter 53, written centuries before Jesus was born, confirmed by the oldest scrolls ever discovered, recognized by the ancient interpreters as messianic, claimed by Jesus himself on the night before he died, and fulfilled in every detail by one man in one city on one cross during one Passover weekend in Jerusalem. If you have never read it slowly, read it now, and when you do not start at chapter 53. Start where the passage actually begins, Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13. Because the introduction changes everything. Thank you for watching until the end. To help us keep this channel alive and these stories free for everyone, please consider supporting us. You can scan the QR code on your screen or use the donation links in the description. Whether you give financially or simply keep us in your prayers, I am deeply grateful for you. God bless you, and I will see you next time.